In a city that has long been regarded as a bastion of legal order and procedural discipline, the destruction of a 42-year-old residential complex in the district of Tai Po began as a narrative of structural fatigue and unfortunate timing. According to official records, the building had recently undergone an extensive renovation plan, valued at approximately 330 million Hong Kong dollars, an effort intended to prolong the life of a property that had already surpassed several modern safety benchmarks. Yet within a single night, that structure was reduced to a darkened framework, its once familiar corridors transformed into a landscape of charred concrete and warped steel. The speed and scale of the fire, documented through multiple eyewitness accounts and emergency response logs, created an immediate sense of urgency. Flames traveled across building exteriors, bypassing physical separations that typically slow the progression of heat and combustion. For residents who viewed their homes as routine extensions of daily life, the transition from normalcy to catastrophe occurred too quickly to comprehend. The central question emerging from the aftermath was not only how the blaze began, but how it achieved such reach and intensity within such a compressed span of time. Before we continue, these stories explore the darkest intersections of human decisions, institutional procedures, and the fragile boundaries that separate safety from vulnerability. They are not merely sensational accounts, but examinations of the mechanisms that shape public risk. To remain informed about the next investigations and the next files we will open, consider subscribing and activating notifications. In the world of crime and forensic inquiry, the truth rarely fades with time. It waits to be reconstructed. The complex known as Wang Fuk Court stood in a location that many analysts have described as increasingly strategic. Tai Po, once viewed primarily as a residential district, has gradually become an area of interest for developers and urban planners due to its expanding infrastructure and proximity to emerging commercial routes. Over the past decades, the building at the heart of this investigation had slowly shifted from being a conventional living space to becoming a point of tension between aging architecture and rising land value. Structurally, the property reflected a generation of construction that preceded contemporary fire-resistant standards. Aging electrical systems, deteriorating concrete, and limited retrofitting created a challenging environment for long-term maintenance. Resident complaints, filed across different periods, referenced issues ranging from water leakage to malfunctioning utilities, suggesting a pattern of strain that accumulated over many years. Maintenance costs rose steadily, while the building's market relevance declined, creating a widening gap between operational burden and economic return. This tension between a building nearing the end of its functional lifespan and a plot of land gaining strategic importance laid the early foundation for many of the questions raised after the incident. The fire was undeniably destructive, yet its consequences extended beyond physical damage. It reshaped the discussion around land management, renovation practices, and the balance between public safety and urban transformation. As we begin to examine the sequence of events, one issue becomes increasingly clear. The story of Wang Fuk Court is not only about a fire. It is about the circumstances that allowed such a fire to grow, the systems that were intended to prevent it, and the broader environment in which those systems operated. The history of Wang Fuk Court begins long before the night of the fire, in an era when residential expansion across Hong Kong aimed to keep pace with rapid population growth and the changing economic landscape of the region. The complex, built more than 4 decades ago, represented the architectural standards of its time, a period in which cost efficiency and speed of construction took precedence over the fire-resistant design principles that later became integral to modern building codes. As years passed, this generational gap in safety standards created a widening divide between what residents needed for long-term security and what the original structure was capable of providing without significant intervention. According to maintenance records and resident reports, the building had progressively shown signs of structural fatigue. Electrical conduits and plumbing lines, installed during its initial construction cycle, were aging beyond their intended operational lifespan. Reinforced concrete showed visible wear through surface spalling and weakening support elements, while moisture infiltration created additional stress points that could not be fully resolved through routine patchwork repairs. For many families, these issues were not merely inconveniences, but persistent reminders that their living environment demanded more comprehensive attention than incremental maintenance could offer. These concerns contributed to a growing consensus that the property required a major renovation effort. Consequently, an extensive improvement project was launched, allocating approximately 330 million Hong Kong dollars to revitalize the complex. The official objective of this initiative, as outlined in the project scope, was to extend the building's usable life by addressing both structural weaknesses and outdated utility systems. The scope also involved upgrades intended to align parts of the property with contemporary building expectations. However, the presence of such a high budget raised its own set of questions within the community, particularly regarding how the funds were distributed and how the renovation timeline was managed. The complexity of overseeing an aging structure, while residents continued to occupy their homes, introduced additional logistical pressure that shaped the environment leading up to the incident. Beyond the physical condition of the building itself, a broader contextual factor influenced how the property was perceived by analysts and stakeholders. Over recent years, the district of Tai Po had become an increasingly prominent zone for development planning. Infrastructure expansion, improved transportation routes, and evolving commercial activity contributed to a shift in how urban designers evaluated the district's long-term potential. While Wang Fuk Court remained a residential community, the land on which it stood gradually increased in strategic value due to these shifting development patterns. This development pressure created a dual identity for the property. On one hand, it was a home to long-term residents whose daily routines and memories were tied to its familiar corridors. On the other hand, from a macroeconomic perspective, the location represented an opportunity for future redevelopment, where modern structures could replace older buildings to support commercial and residential growth demands. This duality did not imply wrongdoing or hidden motives, but it did illuminate the complex intersection of urban planning needs, financial considerations, and the lived experience of the community. One of the recurring themes in the discourse surrounding the property was the inherent difficulty of redeveloping residential land through standard procedural channels. According to urban renewal policies, redevelopment often requires the negotiation of compensation agreements with individual property owners, coordination with regulatory guidelines, and extended legal processes to ensure that all parties are treated fairly. For large residential complexes, these procedures can involve hundreds of stakeholders, each with unique financial positions and differing expectations for compensation. As a result, redevelopment projects of this type can extend over many years, creating delays that influence both economic forecasting and long-term planning. The longevity and cost of these procedures often act as deterrents for developers or stakeholders who aim to initiate redevelopment promptly. The administrative layers designed to protect residents can inadvertently become obstacles when there is interest in utilizing land more efficiently. These circumstances do not indicate that redevelopment is improper. Rather, they highlight the inherent challenge of balancing individual rights with urban growth demands in densely populated regions. Wang Fuk Court, by virtue of its age and location, became a case study in this tension, long before any discussion of the fire emerged. The economic climate surrounding the region contributed another dimension to this complex scenario. Reports from financial analysts noted that broader economic indicators had been under strain due to shifting market confidence, decreased investment flows, and slowdowns in property-related activity. When macroeconomic conditions tighten, interest in unlocking high-value land assets often increases, as such assets are viewed as potential catalysts for renewed economic momentum. This dynamic was not specific to a single property or district. Rather, it reflected a larger pattern observed across various markets in times of economic pressure. In this context, Wang Fuk Court stood at the intersection of multiple forces: a building with aging infrastructure, a community with increasing maintenance needs, a district experiencing rising strategic value, and an economic environment that placed heightened emphasis on redevelopment opportunities. These combined factors formed an intricate foundation for the questions that would follow the fire. None of these factors offer conclusions on their own. Instead, they provide a framework for understanding why the incident prompted such extensive discussion among investigators, analysts, and members of the public. Ultimately, the circumstances surrounding the property created a backdrop that made the fire's consequences particularly significant. The event did not occur within an isolated or static environment. It occurred within a setting shaped by economic transitions, architectural aging, and evolving development priorities. As investigators began examining the technical and environmental details of the fire, the broader context became essential for interpreting why the incident drew such sustained scrutiny. With this background established, the next step in the investigation is to examine how the fire progressed, what conditions influenced its spread, and how structural and environmental factors may have contributed to its intensity. What do you think about the relationship between aging infrastructure and modern redevelopment pressures? Share your thoughts below. The progression of the fire at Wang Fuk Court introduced a series of technical observations that investigators and independent analysts found necessary to examine in detail. The speed with which flames traveled across exterior surfaces and reached multiple building blocks within a short period raised questions about the environmental and structural conditions present at the time of the incident. According to fire behavior studies, the spread of heat and flame across open gaps is typically slowed by distance, airflow disruption, and structural breaks. In this case, however, multiple blocks ignited in close succession, suggesting that certain temporary configurations around the building may have altered how heat transferred across the complex. One configuration frequently cited in technical assessments was the extensive scaffolding system erected as part of the ongoing renovation project. Scaffolding assembled from bamboo and similar materials has long been used in construction due to its flexibility and ease of installation. However, when it surrounds large sections of a building and is combined with synthetic construction netting, the resulting structure may influence how fire behaves. Analysts noted that bamboo is a natural material that can ignite under certain conditions, and when paired with netting made from combustible polymers, a continuous surface can be formed along exterior walls. This surface, in theory, may allow heat to travel more efficiently than it would across exposed open air. In addition to the scaffolding, construction netting plays a significant role in airflow and heat transfer. Netting is often used to prevent debris from falling and to control dust, but its material composition varies depending on supplier and project specifications. Some forms of netting are more heat-resistant than others, while certain polymer-based varieties can degrade or ignite when exposed to sustained high temperatures. In the context of Wang Fuk Court, visual documentation shows that large sections of netting had been installed across multiple levels. When combined with the bamboo framework, analysts observed that these elements may have unintentionally created pathways through which heat could move rapidly along the building's exterior. Another factor identified during technical reviews was the presence of insulation and protective materials placed near windows and along exterior corridors. According to renovation guidelines, insulation panels may be installed temporarily to shield interior units from dust, noise, or weather exposure during construction. Some of these panels, depending on their composition, can contribute to heat accumulation or act as additional fuel if they ignite. In several recorded fire incidents worldwide, synthetic insulation materials have been known to accelerate flame spread when placed in close proximity to other combustible elements. It is important to emphasize that the use of such materials does not imply improper conduct. Their presence only provides context for understanding how fire intensity may have escalated. Eyewitness accounts mentioned that windows and external passageways were partially covered during renovation activities. This type of covering can reduce ventilation in affected areas, causing heat to concentrate and creating what some fire analysts describe as a localized combustion chamber effect. When ventilation is limited, temperatures can rise quickly, and flames can intensify in a manner that is not typical of open-air burns. In certain conditions, this effect may cause windows to fail earlier than expected, or allow flames to penetrate interior spaces more rapidly. The combination of scaffolding, netting, and exterior coverings formed a temporary environment that differed significantly from the building's original architectural design. Investigators acknowledged that temporary construction environments can introduce new variables that influence fire dynamics. While none of these elements alone establish the cause of the fire, their interaction may offer insight into why the blaze expanded with unusual speed and reached structural components that are normally insulated from direct exposure. Another area that prompted technical review was the performance of fire safety systems during the critical early minutes of the incident. According to survivor statements, some emergency alarms did not activate immediately, and certain evacuation routes were reported to be obstructed by construction materials. These observations require careful analysis because temporary construction zones can involve adjustments to alarm circuitry or partial closures of hallways for safety or maintenance reasons. The presence of obstacles does not automatically signify negligence. However, it highlights the importance of evaluating how renovation activities may influence emergency responsiveness. In multi-block residential complexes, the early functioning of alarm systems often determines whether occupants have sufficient time to evacuate safely. If alarms are muted for testing or temporarily disconnected to prevent false triggers during renovation, this may delay the dissemination of critical information. Investigators noted that even minor delays can alter evacuation outcomes, especially in environments where heat spreads rapidly. The question that arises is not whether any specific individual is responsible, but how the integration of renovation logistics may have affected overall system readiness. The temperature reached during the fire also drew attention from structural engineers. Reports noted that sections of reinforced concrete exhibited warping or surface deformation. Reinforced concrete is generally resilient under high heat, but when temperatures escalate beyond certain thresholds for sustained periods, the steel reinforcement can expand, placing stress on surrounding concrete. This phenomenon has been documented in severe building fires and does not necessarily imply the presence of accelerants. However, it does indicate that the fire reached a level of intensity uncommon for standard residential incidents. Analysts suggested that a combination of external combustible materials, constrained ventilation, and continuous heat pathways may have contributed to this outcome. These technical elements, viewed collectively, form a complex picture of an environment in which multiple temporary and structural factors may have influenced the trajectory of the fire. Each factor, considered independently, remains inconclusive, yet when examined together, they raise questions about how construction configurations, material usage, and system readiness interacted during the incident. The purpose of this analysis is not to provide definitive conclusions, but to outline the conditions that may have shaped the event and to encourage continued examination of how fire safety protocols adapt to evolving construction environments. Before moving on to the next stage of the investigation, one question remains central. How should renovation projects balance the need for temporary structures with the obligation to maintain uncompromised fire safety standards? As the investigation into the Wang Fuk Court fire progressed, attention gradually expanded from the physical behavior of the blaze to the surrounding operational environment in which the event unfolded. Analysts studying the sequence of preparation, construction activity, and emergency response noted that understanding the broader logistical setting was essential for interpreting how so many variables converged during the incident. In particular, the renovation project that preceded the fire became a focal point of inquiry, not because it implied wrongdoing, but because it introduced an extensive set of temporary changes to the building ecosystem. These changes, when combined with the physical vulnerabilities of an aging structure, may have contributed to an elevated level of systemic fragility. The renovation itself represented a large-scale undertaking, with a budget of approximately 330 million Hong Kong dollars. The project aimed to address deterioration that had accumulated over 4 decades. Such undertakings typically involve multiple contractors, layered oversight, and subcontracted teams tasked with specialized components of the work. Investigators often examine such projects to understand how decisions regarding material selection, scaffolding layout, and staging areas may influence on-site safety. This does not suggest intent, rather, it acknowledges that complex renovation ecosystems can create situations in which certain risks escalate indirectly through the interaction of several smaller factors. According to reports filed by residents, some concerns surfaced prior to the fire about delays in construction progress, the quality of materials, and the management of work zones. These concerns were part of routine discourse that often surrounds large residential renovation projects. However, in the context of a fire investigation, even minor logistical issues may become relevant because they inform the structural and environmental conditions present at the time of the event. For example, when multiple subcontractors are involved, oversight is distributed across teams that may operate with differing safety practices or levels of experience. This distribution can create gaps in coordination that warrant scrutiny from an investigative viewpoint. One element requiring deeper examination was the placement of temporary construction materials around emergency pathways. Several survivors reported that certain stairwells or corridors had been partially obstructed by stacked boards, insulation debris, or equipment awaiting removal. While such observations are not unusual on renovation sites, their presence in a fire emergency raises important questions about how temporary storage protocols were established and whether they were adjusted as the project evolved. In emergency scenarios, accessibility can determine the difference between timely evacuation and hazardous delay. Investigators typically evaluate whether pathways were meant to be temporarily closed, whether signage was properly displayed, and how materials were positioned relative to designated escape routes. The performance of the fire alarm system added another dimension to this line of inquiry. Statements suggested that alarms did not activate immediately during the initial phase of the incident. In renovation environments, systems may be temporarily disabled for testing or maintenance, but the extent of such adjustments is generally regulated by safety guidelines. Investigators examined whether any portions of the alarm system were offline, whether communication lines were compromised by construction activity, or whether the fire originated in a zone not directly connected to active detectors at that moment. These questions do not assign fault, but aim to determine whether system readiness aligned with the complexities of an active construction site. As technical analysts continued to evaluate material usage, additional attention was directed toward the types of insulation, protective coverings, and exterior elements present during renovation. Certain forms of insulation, particularly polymer-based products, can release significant heat when ignited. Their presence does not imply intentional placement for harmful purposes. Instead, it prompts examination of whether the materials used met the safety requirements appropriate for buildings undergoing large-scale renovation while occupied by residents. The potential interaction between these materials and the scaffolding network formed a key component of the analysis because their combined behavior under high temperatures could have amplified the fire's spread. The intensity of the blaze also raised structural questions that continued into later phases of the investigation. Reports indicated that reinforced concrete components exhibited unusual deformation, which may point to exposure to elevated temperatures for extended periods. Engineers analyzing the aftermath noted that such deformation does not occur under typical residential fires unless additional fuel sources or constrained ventilation contribute to prolonged heat concentration. In the case of Wang Fuk Court, the combination of combustible exterior elements and reduced airflow may have produced an environment in which heat accumulated more quickly and maintained high intensity. Again, this does not imply purposeful escalation, but it underscores the importance of understanding the cumulative effects of renovation activity on fire dynamics. Another aspect requiring careful review was the displacement impact on residents. Hundreds of individuals were forced to vacate their homes immediately following the incident, and many reported uncertainty about compensation, temporary housing, and long-term prospects for returning to the site. From an investigative standpoint, such displacement is not evidence of motive, but it is a measurable outcome that influences how residents interpret the incident and how external observers contextualize it. Analysts often examine whether emergency support systems responded proportionately, whether communication with residents was consistent, and how the decision-making process progressed regarding the building's structural status after the fire. As discussions expanded beyond the structural and operational issues, broader economic questions entered the narrative. Property redevelopment in dense urban environments often involves extensive timelines, negotiations with residents, and regulatory clearances. Analysts noted that a fire can rapidly alter the redevelopment landscape by changing the physical condition of a property. This observation does not suggest intention. Rather, it explains why the incident became the subject of wide public scrutiny. When a building is rendered uninhabitable, the redevelopment process may accelerate, since the negotiations involved in replacing occupied housing differ significantly from those required for damaged structures. Some observers pointed out that the economic climate at the time included pressures associated with reduced liquidity in certain sectors, slower market confidence, and shifting development priorities. In periods of economic strain, land parcels with high redevelopment potential naturally draw closer attention from analysts and policymakers. This context, when viewed alongside the fire, amplified public interest in the event and raised questions about how economic forces intersect with structural vulnerabilities in older residential districts. These questions remain part of a broader analytical framework, rather than an assertion of causation. Finally, the incident highlighted a wider systemic concern: how urban environments adapt to the challenges of aging infrastructure, rising redevelopment demand, and the practical constraints of maintaining safety during major renovation projects. As buildings continue to age across dense cities, and as redevelopment pressures increase, the need for transparent and well-coordinated renovation protocols becomes increasingly essential. Fire safety systems, material standards, and evacuation readiness must evolve in tandem with these pressures to prevent vulnerabilities from compounding. In reviewing the technical, operational, and contextual elements surrounding Wang Fuk Court, one theme emerges consistently. The incident cannot be interpreted through a single lens. It arose at the convergence of structural age, renovation complexity, economic considerations, and emergency readiness. Each factor provides information without providing definitive conclusions. Together, they create a foundation for ongoing inquiry that seeks to understand not only what happened, but how similar vulnerabilities can be prevented elsewhere. Before moving forward, a question remains for those following this investigation. In environments where aging infrastructure and redevelopment pressures intersect, what oversight mechanisms should be strengthened to ensure that renovation activities do not inadvertently create heightened fire risks? The aftermath of the Wang Fuk Court fire extends far beyond the physical perimeter of the damaged complex. It stands as a reminder of how intricate the relationship can be between aging infrastructure, renovation procedures, and the broader economic environment in which a residential property exists. According to structural assessments and public reports, the incident revealed a constellation of vulnerabilities that only emerged because several independent factors converged at the same moment. This convergence does not, on its own, establish intent or negligence. It illustrates how modern cities must continually evaluate the frameworks that guide building maintenance, redevelopment planning, and emergency readiness. At its core, the incident underscored the fragility that develops when residential buildings approach the end of their practical lifespan. Structures built under earlier construction standards carry risks that may not become fully visible until they are placed under extraordinary stress. The renovation project, intended to extend the life of the property, inadvertently created a temporary environment in which ordinary safety mechanisms operated under unusual conditions. When combined with combustible exterior materials, constrained ventilation, and evolving construction layouts, the building entered a state in which minor disruptions could escalate rapidly. These observations suggest that renovation protocols may require further modernization, particularly when residents remain inside the property during major structural work. The displacement of residents following the fire highlighted a second layer of impact Families were forced to leave their homes without clarity on timelines, compensation terms, or long-term plans for rebuilding. Their experience brings attention to the human dimension of large-scale incidents, in which material damage is only one part of the overall loss. The interruption of daily routines, the uncertainty surrounding property rights, and the emotional stress of relocation all contribute to the long-term consequences of such events. These outcomes emphasize the need for stronger communication strategies and more resilient emergency assistance frameworks that support communities facing sudden disruption. A third dimension involves the broader urban environment. The incident occurred at a time when analysts described increasing pressure on redevelopment across multiple districts. While economic circumstances do not explain or justify any individual event, they do shape the context in which redevelopment conversations take place. The fire, viewed through this lens, raised questions about how cities can manage redevelopment needs without allowing economic urgency to overshadow essential safety considerations. These questions are not allegations. They are policy reflections that emerge naturally when communities witness a catastrophic failure of infrastructure. From an investigative standpoint, the key lesson is the necessity of transparency and comprehensive review. Incidents of this scale demand not only technical evaluation, but also a clear communication pathway that informs the public about findings, revisions to safety standards, and long-term plans for affected residents. According to analysts familiar with past urban incidents, such transparency strengthens public confidence and ensures that future safety measures are shaped by evidence rather than speculation. Ultimately, the fire at Wang Fuk Court serves as a solemn reminder that the integrity of a city depends not only on the strength of its buildings, but also on the systems designed to maintain them, the oversight mechanisms that regulate them, and the public trust that sustains them. As the community continues to rebuild physically and emotionally, the essential task ahead is to ensure that the vulnerabilities exposed by this incident inform the development of safer, more resilient frameworks for the future. Before we close this chapter, one question remains for all who examine events such as these. What safeguards should be implemented to ensure that renovation, redevelopment, and emergency preparedness evolve together rather than diverge in ways that create new risks?